This
today.
conference will now be recorded.
So thank you for being here today. A very warm welcome to all participants and to all speakers. This is a webinar organized by the Global Shippers Alliance. For your information, the Global Shippers Alliance represents the logistics interests of manufacturers, retailers, wholesalers, collectively referred as shippers. GSA consists of the Asian Shippers Alliance, the European Shippers Council, and also the American Association of Exporters and Importers. The objective of Global Shippers Alliance is to intervene in the field of intermodal and international transport on all fields, and also in terms of trade, in a joint and coordinated way to promote the evolution of regulation, markets, and practices. This will better facilitate the flow of goods between the continents. My name is Jordi Espin. I am the Strategic Relations Manager at the European Shippers Council and also the Secretary General of the Spanish Shippers Council, and I will be guiding you through the session of today under the following title, Suez Canal, what else for global shippers? At the beginning, just with that, we start with a disclaimer. It's important to consider that all opinions mentioned in this webinar are referred to the speakers, and this is important to be considered for the information of today and the one we are going to refer later on. As I said at the beginning, the program today is split into blocks. The first one is a keynote session with two important keynotes, one from Jan Hoffmann, Chief Trade Logistics Branch from the DTL and UNCTAD on the Suez impact, and then the other keynote is as well on the Suez situation from Lars Jensen. And then the second block, after this, there will be some kind of regulation or legal framework where there will be three lawyers speaking about consequences, about the Suez situation and competition issues, and also referring to a collective claim. And then at the end, there will be a Q&A session where we will attend all comments coming from QA and from the chat that you can use here. So thank you for attending here today, for being here today. Thank you to all panelists for the attention and the time for preparation, all the valuable information that will be shared today. And the important point is to be on time, so let's start. I introduce you to Denis Schumert, the chairman of the Global Shippers Alliance and also the president of the European Shippers Council. Denis, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jordi, and welcome everyone listening. Well, this maritime market has been a roller coaster type of situation last year, but clearly this year it's rock and roll for shippers. Our title is provocative, Suez Canal, what else for shippers? What else means worse or better? Is a Suez blockade the drop that will break the camel's back? What our BCOs experience today, Europe, USA, Asia, are well summarized by the quotes of Lodestar yesterday. First quote, relationships with carriers count for nothing these days. The carriers are very opportunistic. They take high rate spot shipments rather than contract shipments. And carriers are not honoring the minimum quantity commitments of their contracts. So they force us into the spot market to find space. These empowered carriers now set limits on how much volume they are prepared to allocate to contracts, who tend to pay less than spot shippers and NVOCCs do pay. So what will happen? What will be the consequences of this situation for each party and for the global economy at large? I guess Jan and Lars will shed light on these questions. Then on the regulatory side, ESC, European Shippers Council, and other European organizations have been reaching out many times to the European Commission to no avail as of today. FMC in the US is investigating the damage done to US agricultural products exporters by carriers squeezing their deliveries of empty equipment to the Middle West. But this will have no short-term impact for sure. So how can one harness the pricing power of the carriers oligopoly, which might not have been manipulating the market, but they are clearly profiting of it, if not profiteering, while delivering such a poor quality of service? So our legal experts may propose some clues on it. Our regulation could set measures to avoid such an imbalance to last or to come back again. So thanks again for attending, and now I give the floor to Jan.
So
Okay.
Jan, the floor is yours. Yeah, Jan Hoffmann, Chief and Trade Logistics Branch DTL at UNCTAD. Thank you for being here today. The floor is yours, and you can share your screen. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you very much. No, very happy to be here. You know, the shippers are really our key allies. UNCTAD is very much supporting, from the clients, from the importers, exporters perspective, the whole issue of maritime transport chain. So let me share the screen and share some thoughts on the topic of this very interesting webinar. Happy to see many friends and colleagues. I'm not sure if you can see only the screen now, or you see the little, maybe I have to move these ones to the right.
We see the whole presentation still.
Okay. Okay. You do not see the little one that says go to meeting? Let me try if with the full screen. Do you see
now
only the presentation?
We see only the presentation. Yeah, that's fine. And also yourself. So that's fine.
Okay, good. Because I also see little menus about the go-to meeting, but then it's fine. Then it seems to work. If not, you interrupt me. So it is about the Suez Canal and what else for shippers. And what else for shippers is really that there was, in my view, lots of hype and actually exaggeration about the impact of the Suez Canal. It was called a black swan. Now, the good news is the incident got shipping into the news and it got more awareness among policymakers, and it had highlight three key long-term challenges for global shippers. Markets, constellation shipping, freight rates, I look into those. Something on technology, solutions, trackings, intermodal, trade facilitation. And then also there was this issue, well, the ships had to go longer, they emitted more CO2, they had to speed up to catch up the lost time. All this was bad for the CO2 emissions or added CO2 emission. But of course, that's only very small compared to the real big challenge. So let me go through those three. It could now, there it goes. So number one, markets. So freight rates really surged after the incident. And they had started to go down. And when you see, I hope you can see that on the screen, you see the little, the peak then going down, and where it started going up again, this is exactly when the Ever Given was stuck. Now, what I find interesting here, so I'm a bit contradicting myself. I said there was a lot of hype and it was not that much impact, but actually here we do see impact. For me, the interesting part is the routes that do not go through Suez, like Shanghai to Santos or Shanghai to Lagos, they were the ones going up first and more. And that just shows how interconnected that whole maritime logistics is, the lack of empty boxes, empty containers. So if there are ships in the Mediterranean, they cannot go through the canal, and their empty containers will then be missing in Shanghai, then this leads to higher freight rates for the routes to Santos, which is rather long, which is thin in that sense, not so many providers, and you have to pay for the empty containers on the return route. So this is among the reasons why this then went up over the world. And yes, you already alluded to the discussion. Is this now a reflection of oligopolistic markets, or abuses, and service reliability has gone down and recently picked up, but and or the shortage of containers? I think this particular high peak here is a technical situation. There's simply not enough equipment. Ships are waiting in front of Los Angeles. There are not enough containers. Now, the underlying trend and the underlying long-term situation where we have more. I'm surprised it should be moving. There it is, the next one. Okay. So you see a long-term trend here, and I see Mike and Antonella in the room. This is with data from MDS Transmodal. So you see three trends here. The first three lines are about ship sizes, and you see that ships get bigger. The total largest ship size, the average of the biggest ship, that's for about 1,000 ports, so that's average per port. Then there is the average of all ships. The blue line is the total deployed capacity, which also goes up, but not quite as much. So just mathematically, if ship sizes go up more than the total deployed capacity, something has to give. And this something is the number of companies that provide services, the average of companies per port. And there you had the Hanjins of this world. You had Hamburg Süd buying CCNI, then Maersk buying Hamburg Süd. It's also per port. Maybe the companies still exist, but they don't provide service to this port. So I think this is a very important picture, and we can illustrate this also with some nice little moving maps. So two sides of the same coin. Here, every dot is a port, and the size of the dot is the size of the largest ship going to this port. And you see how these bubbles get bigger and also darker or red. So it's over the last 15 years. And you really see how the biggest ships are deployed on the east-west route, Europe, Asia. And the same, I love histograms, and I think this is very illustrative. You see the same data now as a distribution. You see how the biggest ship goes up over the last 15 years. The media, like the 50% point, and the mean or the average, how they increase, and how this distribution is, you have a certain number of ports where the largest ships go, and then many ship sizes with not so many ports where those ships go. And still the largest number, the 50% of ports, receive ships of 1,800 TEUs or less. The other side of the coin now is the number of companies. Same little map. Now we start with bigger bubbles, and we see how these bubbles become smaller and how there are fewer companies providing services. It started, I think, Antwerp, Singapore, they were the ones with the highest number of providers providing services from to the port. And this number has gone down. Again, same story here. Here it starts with a higher number. And I find it interesting, the median, the 50% point remains 3. So it means like half of the world's ports receive only 1, 2, or 3 companies that provide services from and to this port. I find this very illustrative to show this very long-term trend important for shippers. On the one hand, economies of scale. On the other hand, less choice. And this is actually not such a new situation. Once upon a time, there was an article in The Economist that claimed 10 years ago, but it's still valid, so I put it here again. So the article said, shippers benefit from economies of scale. Well, then there was this guy from Geneva who wrote to them and said, well, dear economist, the term shipper was wrongly used in the article. The shipper is the client, as you in this room know, that is the importer or export of goods. The provider of the service is the shipping line or the carrier. Furthermore, although it is true that the carriers benefit from economies of scale, which help to reduce their costs, these cost savings still need to be passed on to the client, the shipper. And the same trend of market concentration that I just showed to you with the two sides of the same coin on these two videos, it leads to cost savings, but it may also lead to less competition. And on routes where there are less than 5 carriers providing liner services, there's evidence that the process of concentration leads, in effect, to higher freight rates. So not all cost savings will be passed on in the form of lower freight rates to the shipper. At UNCTAD, we are particularly concerned with the situation of least developed countries, small island developing states. Frankly, I still think there is quite some choice for European shippers. But there's another related situation, which is the vertical integration. This photo here, for example, I took in Buenos Aires, standing on the gantry crane on the Dubai port operated terminal, looking at a ship of Hamburg Süd. On the other side is a terminal operated by AP Möller, and AP Möller or Maersk had just purchased Hamburg Süd and the Dubai port, the same situation actually in Callao. They were rightly worried that the new parent will tell the daughter, please don't go to bed any longer with the other guys, please come to my terminal. So that's certainly a complex, complicated situation. So the alliances, in my view, the alliances and the mergers and this consolidation shipping is above all a challenge for the ports, where the shipping lines can group the demand. They are the clients. You have an oligopsone. For the shippers, there are some advantages. We are here among friends. Don't shoot the messenger. There are efficiency gains thanks to the alliances. Let's say 10% more utilization. You need fewer ships if you have better utilization. But of course, then when it comes to capacity management at the beginning of the crisis, not anymore, but at the beginning, there was some management, blank sailings and so on. The reliability is still not so good. So that's a bit on this point. Second point that was highlighted by the Ever Given is really the need for further nowcasting, advanced planning, port call optimization. In Geneva here with UNCTAD, with the WTO, but also collaborating with the WCO, we are convinced we need global multilateral standards and solutions. Same for the IMO. I mean, really, shipping needs global standards and solutions. How do we set today the rules for the future of maritime transport? I like to say technological progress will never be as slow as today. Is it slow? No, it is not slow. It's very fast, but it's exponential. So technological progress will be even faster in future. Think 10 years, 20 years back. Think blockchain, AI, drones, what have you, Internet of Things. How this is advanced over the last 20 years, and now think even faster progress over the next year. So whatever rules we make for digitalization, for decarbonization, I actually think we should, and the regulators should be optimistic and be very demanding, very ambitious, because technology will advance. Who has led the IT reforms in your company? The CEO, CTO, COVID-19. Quite often it's COVID-19 that pushed. We have in UNCTAD, we developed at the beginning of the pandemic a so-called, we call it 10-point action plan, going along the supply chain from the ship to the port, leaving the port, transit, landlocked countries, and so on. And a lot of this has to do with digitalization. And we see more demand for reforms. We have additional projects, additional funding, which of course then we have to implement without going to the countries, more with online, distance and customs automation, single windows, and so on. I like to say we have to lock in the progress made during lockdown. So we see progress in these areas, and we must make sure they stay on after the pandemic, if ever there's really an after, at least, but that's another long story. One key message I just like to highlight here: if ever you come across a presentation, a PowerPoint, or somebody saying there's a balance or a trade-off between either facilitating trade and modernizing and reforming, or protecting my population from weapons of mass destruction, drugs, COVID, whatever, this is really the wrong picture. All the solutions we are promoting in UNCTAD, CFAC, WCO, WTO, single windows, risk management, automation, pre-arrival processing, electronic payments, and so on and so forth, more transparency, they help achieve both. They make controls easier, they save funds, and they facilitate trade. So in that sense, there's actually a positive push. Last but not least, the third trend, the really, I think, biggest transition in shipping, the biggest long-term challenge, is the decarbonization. Would be a very long story. Just want to share with you some work we have done, and again, I saw friends from NDS Transmode in the room. They were instrumental to some parts of these big important puzzle pieces. So without going through the whole study here, so the IMO undertook, asked UNCTAD to undertake an impact assessment of what these short-term measures mean for the states, because the IMO members would not agree to the next step, to advancing with these short-term measures to decarbonize, if they didn't know the impact. And here I like to remember and remind friends and colleagues, about 26 years ago now, I used to work for the IMO. And this document here in front of you from 1995, to my knowledge, is the first one that officially introduced the concept of internalization of externalities. When I presented it, there were some colleagues at that time, IMO has really advanced a lot, but at that time, they talked about the internationalization of externalities. And I said, no, that's the internalization. So where are we going? How can we from UNCTAD support this? Overall, there's some positive trend. If you compare the dotted line here, which show the emissions, with the non-dotted lines, which show the fleet, you can see that the emissions have grown less than the fleet. So that's good news. The fleet has become more efficient, but it is still growing. It is still growing. So if we want to reduce, we need to see who are the ones that are emitting. Shipping was initially not really included in the Paris Agreement because it was said, well, you cannot assign the shipping and air to countries. Well, you can. Nowadays, you can say it's Panama, Liberia, Marshall Islands, not because they are bad, but simply because they have many ships under the flag. By the same token, you could assign it to the owner, to the trader, to the geographical region. It is possible. So in order to agree on the short-term measure, IMO members decided that they require a comprehensive impact assessment. We undertook this assessment for all ships journeys, all countries' economies, and quite proud of this comprehensive assessment. Now, three finest charts, what does this mean now? Is this a lot, is it not, this impact? If you compare the cost increase, even the highest among different scenarios, to the normal volatility, like on this chart. You remember this chart I showed you earlier, no? How is the freight rate from Shanghai to Santos, how it goes up and down, up and down. So is this increase in costs due to the additional investment that is necessary and the additional ships that are necessary, because ships have to go slower to emit less CO2? Is this a lot or not? You decide. It's certainly less than the normal volatility, but it is not nothing. And because depending on what you trade, what is the elasticity of demand, there is an impact on trade. And those countries that are further away, and some you cannot see on this map, the small island states, they are more affected than others in impact on trade. So here you have a reduction of trade that we simulate for 2030. So 2030 with IMO measures vis-a-vis 2030 without. We are not comparing to today. We are comparing two 2030 scenarios. Is this a lot? It's not a lot. Well, 2% is not nothing for some cases. If you then translate this to GDP, it's really little. It's, when I say here minus 0.02, it is not 2%. It is 0.02%. Yeah, but still, I find it interesting to see developing countries are more negatively affected than developed countries. Coastal countries more than landlocked because of the type of trade, type of transport they use. So is this a lot? Is not a lot? In the end, who will pay? Internalization of externalities means in the end, the shipper will pay. In the end, the consumer will pay. This one it is now on the IMO website for IMO members. I'm happy to share. I find this a very interesting result. We are going in this direction. It is just one step in the decarbonization, which is among the key long-term trends affecting shippers. So I shared with you some data on markets consolidation in liner shipping, which I hope you found interesting. I linked it to what was happening specifically in and after Suez. Then shared some thoughts on technological solutions. And finally, really the biggest long-term challenge for shipping is the decarbonization, where I see many shippers are playing a very positive role. Trafigura, others are actually promoting specific solutions, carbon levy type of things. And shippers are increasingly concerned. They want to know how much CO2 or CO2 equivalent their trade has been emitting. So I think this is another important long-term trend for you, for us, for the shippers' interest. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Jan. Thank you very much for your insights, and also thank you very much for wrapping up at the end of your presentation. Very interesting, and very interesting, especially to know when you compare to the past, the wisdom you are giving concerning the comparison towards what we say today, and when you go back into time, saying that you had said that or you had said this. This is really interesting, yeah, in order to see how mindset and thoughts have changed amongst the time or not. So the comparison is always there, and it's important for that, yeah. So thank you very much for sharing your wisdom. Really valuable, yeah, really valuable.
Thank you, John.
Thank you very much. So let's keep in touch and let's go forward with the session today. Now, the next keynote is from Lars Jensen. Lars is, let me go to my notes. Lars is CEO and partner at Vespucci Maritime, director and partner also at Line Again. He focused on providing expert assistance and analysis on the wider container shipping. He has 19 years of experience inside the container shipping industry. And he has published the following books, Liner Shipping 2025, as well as Culture Shock in Maersk Line. And he's about to publish a new book talking about developments for 2030 and all this. So Lars wanted to attend today. He could not make it to be here at the moment, but he recorded his session. So I share you his recording on the keynote, and I hope you find it interesting. So let me share my screen and let me go to So let me go back to the origin of the recording to see there are some problems. Let me see if it can be heard now.
Hello all, thank you very much for tuning in to listening to me, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to address you here today. My name is Lars Jensen from Vespucci Maritime, and I'm going to share some of my thoughts in terms of what is going on right now, especially in the wake of the Suez incident. When will the problems be over? Or will the problems ever be over? Let's try to have a slight look at that one. And I've prepared a few things here to share with you. If you bear with me here for a second. There we go. So, questions first. Is the Suez situation over, and what should we expect? Well, on the surface of it, of course, it's a silly question. Is it over? Yes. I mean, there is no ship blocking the Suez Canal anymore. And mind you, we should also keep in mind that despite all the massive press coverage, it took 6 days to get the vessel off, which is actually not that bad. We had a similar incident 5 years ago in the Elbe River in Germany with a similar sized vessel. And at that point in time, it took the Germans the same amount of time, 6 days, to get the vessel, in that case, a China shipping vessel, off of the sandbanks and out sailing again. Should we have an expectation that this is suddenly a new normal, that we're going to see ships run aground time and time again in the Suez Canal? There's absolutely nothing indicating that to be the case. Vessels of this size, from the container vessels, there are dozens of transits of the Suez Canal every week, has been for years, without incident. If we look at other vessel types like the oil tankers, we've had massive vessels go through the Suez Canal for decades without incident. So on the basis of what I would tend to call the facts, there's nothing indicating that this is suddenly a big problem that we should expect to recur time and time again. It is much more relevant to see this in the light as this has been a one-off problem. Now, the challenge, of course, is the one-off problem comes on top of a lot of other problems we are battling with at the same time. So we cannot see the Suez Canal in isolation. So what I want to do in the following is to take a look at when is the situation over and what does it mean when it's over. But we need to split our minds into two different mindsets at the same time. Right now, this is the situation we are in container shipping. It feels like, or rather our feet are on fire. We have a very direct, imminent tactical problem. It is hurting everyone. This is clearly where focus is. We need to solve this problem. We need to solve it yesterday. That, of course, shapes also a lot of the planning and thought processes in terms of, for example, questions like this: when is the problem going to be over? In this case, when's the fire put out? However, this is dealing with a tactical problem. When we say when it's over, we need to look at what does that mean? What is the new normal we're going to get back out to? Because once we are through putting out the fire in our feet, what we need to also realize is the normality we're emerging back into is not the normality we were used to before the pandemic. It is different. And that has nothing to do with the pandemic. The pandemic has not fundamentally changed any of the structures. It may have amplified some of the mechanisms, but it does not change them. But there has been a groundswell of change that was going to come anyway. So that's why what I want to do here is to take it as a very clean two-step process. There's the imminent problems we need to discuss and how might they be resolved. But the nature of those problems, and therefore also the solutions to those problems, inherently have not much to do with how we're going to address the structural changes that we are also seeing in the industry. So if we look at the imminent problem, the issue with Suez is it is just one amongst many different factors all unfolding more or less at the same time. And as you can see illustrated here, the problem is if we try to solve one problem, we're just going to run into another and into a third. This is basically your good old-fashioned domino effect. We got multiple different interlocking factors. And if we are to at least outline some of them, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on some of them. Basically, the root of the problems we're seeing right now, that's not true. The root of all the problems is the pandemic, as I'll get back to. But the part of the root of the problem we're seeing right now is we have a demand boom in some markets. And the demand boom is causing, at least that's part of the reason why we're getting shortages of equipment. We're getting shortages of vessels. We're getting port congestion. And whenever we are seeing an attempt to solve one of these problems, it's being blocked by one of the other issues. We have an industry that tries to rebalance the equipment, for example, to mitigate shortages. But that is being prevented by port congestion, which in turn is being driven by a demand boom. But the port congestion serves to soak up vessel capacity. So despite there being a desperate need for more vessels, vessels are effectively being taken out of circulation because of the port congestion. So all these things are interlocking and are amplifying the problems. If we look more into some of the developments, just to give a few examples, if we look over the past year, we have had an extreme amount of volatility. Now, this is global demand growth. What we have seen here is in spring of 2020, when the pandemic first spread, we had a very sharp dip in demand growth. From a global perspective, it was basically akin to when the financial crisis hit the industry more than a decade ago. if you look at this at individual trade lane levels, there were trade lanes quite literally where demand more or less from 1 week to the next dropped 20 to 30%. So into that environment, of course, the carriers will look at it and say, I cannot justify sailing 10 vessels if 3 of them are completely empty. So that led to a raft of blank sailings simply to match this sudden and unexpected huge drop in demand. Now, the problem was then we had demand rebound not that long after. So we had a huge new influx of cargo that needed to be moved. And this is where we are already beginning to see some of these domino effects, because all the sailings that were then blanked in April and May, which were a direct reason for why there was not a lot of demand, so it made sense to blank the sailings. That, of course, leads to a time delayed effect. If I'm blanking a sailing, then I'm also missing that ship to reposition empty containers. And in that time gap, we go from bust to boom on the demand side. So suddenly we are depleting the stores of empty containers very, very rapidly. Now, the way to resolve that problem is to very quickly try to reposition the containers. But as mentioned, that was rendered more or less impossible because of port congestion. So everything ties in. Now, not only do we have this volatility seen over a year, we also see a huge difference from trade lane to trade lane. It is not a uniform demand boom. If we were to make this very black and white, it is a US demand boom. Yes, there are other trades that are also growing, but nowhere near what we're seeing in the US. Very basically, the US consumers apparently have decided that when they cannot spend money on services, they want to sit at home and buy enormous amounts of goods that are moved in containers. That is the driver of the boom. There is no indication this boom is over. And furthermore, looking at data just over the last couple of months, not only do we have extremely high growth in the number of containers moved into the US, we are not seeing inventories being built up. So all of this cargo that's being moved in is actually being sold. And that is another indication that boom is not about to be over. So we have an extreme demand, which of course putting port infrastructure under pressure. And is there any sign that this is getting better? To a large degree, no. There are no good solid measurements across the world on port congestion. I have tried to devise one. In this case, it's simply based on the service advisories by Hyundai Merchant Marine that at least have a traffic light indication across a wide range of different terminals and ports around the world to simply try to measure a semblance of congestion index. And yeah, it shows port congestion actually got worse and worse as we got towards the end of 2020. And both in the terminals and intermodal, there are not really any signs that this is getting better. The only positive spin you could put on this is port congestion is at least not getting any worse. And with port congestion, there is an added issue, because if we have a shortage of vessels in a given trade lane, we can deploy more vessels into that trade, increasing capacity. If there's a shortage of equipment, we can put more equipment into that trade lane, provided it exists, of course. Terminals is a different matter. It doesn't help me very much that I got idle terminal capacity in one part of the world and a shortage in another. I cannot move that capacity. That makes port congestion much more difficult to resolve than shortage of both vessel and equipment capacity. And it is into this reality, it is on top of all these problems that we see the Suez Canal incident happen. Now, if Suez had happened purely in a normal market environment, it would have taken roughly 2 to 3 months to work these issues out of the system. Because again, it's a number of dominoes that are falling. Once the canal reopens, the cargo comes like ketchup out of a ketchup bottle, leading to some port congestion problems in Europe. But as long as the vessel was stuck behind a closed canal or were redirected around Africa, that de facto meant there was a number of sailings that didn't arrive. So you will have temporary blank sailings out of Europe. That will delay the empty container delivery to Asia. And since you already have a shortage in Asia, delay in empty container delivery there actually means increased shortages of container equipment, not just on Asia-Europe, but on all export trades out of Asia, spreading the Suez Canal issue to trades that really have nothing to do with the Suez Canal. And then you're going to have temporary blank sailings out of Asia, because you have all the vessels that were delayed by a week not showing up. So ultimately, these problems will be solved, but the pure operational mechanics is that this will take 2 or 3 months in a normal environment. But where were we before the Suez Canal? How far were we away from having the problem solved? Now, here's the problem. The shortage of empty equipment became most acute late September, early October. From that point in time, if this had been the only problem, it would have taken roughly 3 months to fix. The reason why it is fairly clear it would take 3 months, there are 2 ways to look at it. You can look at the operational mechanics of it, and that brings you to around 3 months. Or you can take a look a decade ago, because we had exactly the same problem in 2010 coming out of the financial crisis. At the end of the financial crisis, carriers had idled a large amount of vessels because there was not enough demand. Suddenly demand came roaring back, and that led to a shortage of empty containers because they were stuck in the wrong place as they had not been repositioned. Precisely the same problem we see it now. Back then, it took about 3 months from the problem was the most acute until it was reasonably resolved. That means the problems we have faced with equipment should have been resolved in February. Now, clearly, that is not the case, because what then came on top was the port congestion. When Suez Canal happened, then we were beginning slowly to see some alleviation of part of the port congestion. It was not solved, but at least some alleviation. So at that point in time, we were looking 2 to 3 months out to get the problem solved. But now we get this 2 to 3 months problem thrown on top, which means what we're going to end up with here is we are likely looking at least 4 to 6 months down the line to get all of these operational issues worked out of the system. And this, of course, has led to what can probably best be described as a very congested and chaotic market. And especially if you are a shipper in this environment, that is what it's going to look like. But there are many ramifications that are involved here. Part of the operational disruption here is, as I mentioned, when you look all the way back to second quarter last year, there was a raft of blank sailings, which of course disrupt supply chains. At the time, those blank sailings were clearly matching with the extreme dip there was in demand in the market. What we then saw towards the end of 2020 and coming into 2021, we're seeing more blank sailings again. And on the surface of it, that seems very strange, because if there is a lack of capacity, why would anybody in their right mind blank sailings? The problem we're faced with now is conceptually different. The reason sailings are being blanked now is the vessels are just not there. Or rather, that's not true. There is enough vessels in the world. There are, by the way, also enough containers, but they are being tied up. Not only do you have port congestion, which in itself ties up an enormous amount of vessels and containers that are effectively out of circulation, we also have vessels around the world where you see crew being tested positive for COVID. When that happens, typically the vessel goes into quarantine for a week or 2 and again is effectively taken out of circulation. You are at a state where charter rates to get more vessels are now at 20-year highs. Virtually every single vessel that can sail are already sailing. So if as a carrier, you are now suddenly in a situation where your vessel is being caught in port congestion, or your vessel is quarantined because one of your crew members got COVID, it is physically impossible to find a replacement vessel. So you have no choice but to blank a sailing. And given vessels can move between different trade lanes, that means as a carrier, the choice is not whether or not you want to cancel. Your choice is where. Where do you want to cancel a sailing? Which trade lane do you want to do this on? That is really the only choice. That, of course, also means, and all shippers have clearly experienced it, we're back to the feet being on fire, this enormous increase there has been in freight rates. And the underlying reason is simple. There is a distinct scarcity of capacity tactically right now. And again, let me emphasize this one clearly. This is a temporary shortage. The reason I am so sure about that is think about it the following way. 2019, there were enough vessels in the world. There were enough containers in the world, no doubt about that. 2020, we moved less cargo than in 2019, and suddenly there were all these shortage problems. So it's not the physical number of container ships that's the problem. It's not the physical number of containers that's the problem. It is the fact that they are being tied up in all these congestion issues that is effectively removing capacity. So we cannot hope to rebalance the market until we get rid of all these bottleneck effects. And as I said, that is likely 4 to 6 months into the future. But does that mean we then have smooth sailing? We get operational normality when we get toward the end of 2021? Not so fast, because did we necessarily see the port congestion coming as badly as it did? Not really. Did we see the Suez incident happen? Not really. So were these to be seen as black swan events? No, because here's another thing we need to keep in mind. Neither the pandemic nor the Suez incident were black swan events. A black swan event is something that was entirely unpredictable. Neither of these were unpredictable. Take the pandemic. We have had pandemics before. It was entirely clear the world would see another pandemic. The only thing we didn't know was, is it going to happen this year or in 50 years from now? The Suez incident, let me not be hypothetical. I was actually writing, had the pleasure of being allowed to write an article for the Journal of Commerce in the beginning of March. So 3 weeks before the Suez incident. And my point of that one was there are risks in container shipping that we know are there, that are large scale. We just don't know where or when they're going to happen. One of those I mentioned as being low likelihood, but significant impact was what if we see the Suez Canal being blocked? 3 weeks later, here we are. But we have other events that we know are going to come. You can see the picture here from the terminal. This is actually a terminal in Japan that got hit by the tsunami after an earthquake. We all know there are places around the world that are earthquake prone. We all know that at some point in time, there will be a major port that will be out of commission for a sizable span of time due to an earthquake. We know that's a known risk. It's not a black swan. The oil tanker on fire is an oil tanker that's been hit by a missile in the Hormuz Strait, for example. It is not outside the realm of possibilities that we could see the Hormuz Strait shut down. Let's hope that doesn't happen. But it's to say there are definitely risk elements out there that has large disruptive impact that we all know are there. Cyber attacks, we've seen them before. They will definitely happen again. We don't know where, we don't know how much. So this is not to say that the world is going to end because of all this. This is more to say these large-scale risks, they have always been here. We might just have neglected them a little bit. And we can also say, how do we tend to deal with these? We deal with them by having resilience in the supply chain. And then we've got to ask ourselves the question, how much do we want to pay for resilience? Because resilience is another word for overcapacity. Somebody needs to pay for it. And the supply chain has been remarkably resilient. We've been through a pandemic, we've been through a Suez incident, and yet almost all the cargo in the world still gets moved. It is severely delayed, yes. It is a lot more costly to move, yes. But the vast majority of cargo actually still moves. So if we want to develop a supply chain that is able to cater for some of these other major scale events I just listed, can that resilience be built? It could, but then we got to ask ourselves, are we willing to pay for that resilience? Because that would mean a huge amount of overcapacity for a long, protracted period of time. Or do we want to make the trade-off of saying we want to have a supply chain that's a lot more lean, and then you're going to have disruptive events every now and then that creates short-term problems, like the problem we're in right now. But let's not forget, the problem we're in right now is operational in nature. It is temporary. Temporary in the sense that we're still looking months into the future, but we're not looking years and decades. If we look years and decades, this is an entirely different discussion. Because once we get back out to the normal state of affairs, it is not what we were used to in 2019. And I cannot stress this enough. The normality we're going to come out to has nothing to do with the pandemic. It's a normality that would have emerged irrespective of the pandemic. It was coming anyway, just as surely as the tide is coming. It contains a number of different elements that have been many years in the making. Let me just go through a few of them. Digitalization is definitely on an upgrowing path now. It has been almost talked to death for the past many years. We are now at a point where this is becoming normality. Then we have consolidation amongst the container carriers. This is also something that has been 20 years in the making. And we are more or less at the logical endpoint of consolidation seen from a carrier perspective. The whole challenge here with consolidation is if you are too fragmented seen from a carrier perspective, you simply cannot act in the current market environment. Let me use the pandemic impact last year just as an illustration of this versus what we saw a decade ago in the financial crisis. When the financial crisis came and demand dropped like a rock, it took more than 3 months before any carriers pulled capacity out. That, of course, also meant during that period, freight rates plummeted considerably. That was because carriers did not remove capacity even though demand dropped. Why would carriers not do that? Well, the explanation is fairly simple. In a fragmented market, a carrier would have, say, 1 weekly service. If demand suddenly drops 30%, what's the choice? I can sail 70% utilized as a carrier. That would be extremely loss-making, not attractive. I could try to lower my price to entice more cargo. That would just start a price war, but that's actually what the carrier's normal modus operandi has been. That's exactly what they did. The only thing I would not do as a carrier in that situation is cancel a sailing. Because if I only have 1 sailing a week, if I cancel my sailing, I now lose the remaining 70% of my volume to my competitors. That is definitely not attractive. In a consolidated market, I might be an alliance. I might have 10 weekly services. Demand drops 30%. Okay, I can then cancel 3 out of the 10 services. That means I can maintain vessel utilization and not needlessly sailing empty ships. That's exactly what has happened. This would have happened anyway. You had seen an increase in the use of blank sailings already in 2018 and 2019 as the alliances were getting up to speed. This is part of the new normal, that capacity will be much more closely matched to demand, which also means the state of affairs going forward. The way I usually think about this is we've been used to a market where there was always an enormous amount of overcapacity, which meant that for most of the time, the carriers were more or less in a price war with each other. And for a few festive events, rates would go up drastically. Going forward, you might see something like the opposite. You're going to see a market where there's going to be some element of excess capacity, that's the resilience, but not a crazy amount of overcapacity, which also means rate levels going forward will structurally be stronger than what you've been used to pre-pandemic. And will there still be price wars? Sometimes yes, but there will be fewer and shorter in nature than what we've been used to. This is part of also maturing a market. This is not unique to container shipping. This is a development you would have seen basically in all commoditized trades. Then we have the whole decarbonization agenda. That is also going to come. This is going to carry an enormous price with it. Right now, nobody has the slightest idea what the exact cost is going to be. The first part where we're really going to feel it will be when there will be carbon taxes. They'll be called different things, but it will de facto be a carbon tax. It will highly likely not be aligned between, say, EU and US and China. So this is going to create more confusion in the market because there will be different surcharges linked to different markets because the carriers cannot control what the tax regimes are going to be in different countries, and the carriers cannot align, obviously, what their carbon surcharges are going to be either. So if you think it's been difficult to deal with bunker surcharges in the wake of the low sulfur fuel, that is child's play compared to what we're likely going to see in terms of a debacle when we need to pass through carbon surcharges going forward. And the final thing, just to have a few words on, we will see the emergence of new contractual frameworks. This industry has had a way of working for decades that is not necessarily optimal. What I see is a structural shift into basically a market where you will have enforceable spot products. These will to a large degree be online and very inflexible. Then you're going to have enforceable contracts with two-way penalties built in. They will likely be slightly shorter in duration than what we're used to because it is hard for both parties to predict with accuracy what are your actual needs 52 weeks out into the future. And then you might also see the emergence of longer-term contracts, 2, 3, 4 years, but they will be less detailed and more act as framework agreements controlling aspects such as what is free time and what are the underlying methodologies to be used in the shorter term enforceable contracts, as an example. But what I'm trying to say here is this is a fundamental structural change in the industry. It was coming anyway. The pandemic did not change it. It will have accelerated parts of it, especially the digitalization part, but it was going to come nonetheless. So with that, I hope I at least have provided you with some food of thought. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending here. Thank you for listening to me, and thank you for inviting me to come here.
So we listened to Lars. Always important to hear his speech. The important point now here is that one of the things we liked of the webinar today is that each participant or each presenter is giving a different layer of information on the same item. So it's not contradicting whatever we are saying, but it's adding additional information so that all attendees can check exactly which point of view they want. As an important point, I mean, Lars was pointing at risk management and the cost risk management has, and also at the resilience and the cost of resilience as well. So now we finished the first block of the two keynotes after Jan Hoffmann and Lars, and now we are moving on the second block, which is more a block on analysis and consequences on the Suez Canal and touch on competition issues as well. So now we start with the first speaker of the second block, Rosa Romero. Rosa Romero, the title of her speech is Suez Consequences, the Unbalanced Framework for Shippers. Rosa is a lawyer specialized in maritime transport and commercial trade at the Lawyers House, specialist teacher in the vocational training of transport and logistics, and also an associate professor of maritime law at the Faculty of Law of University of Barcelona. Rosa, welcome. Thank you for being here with us today. So please, the floor is yours, and also the screen sharing as well.
Hello, good morning. Well, good morning to everybody. It's just a pleasure for me to be here, even virtually in this case, and due to the pandemic, but to share this presentation is a nice opportunity. And well, it's really my passion, maritime law, so thanks a lot to the organization, the Global Shippers Alliance. And let's go to the presentation. Okay, so let's go.
All fine.
Well, so it's okay. Yeah. And so, well, what happened in Suez Canal last month made me think about a lot of things, as everybody here. And this is part of these thoughts. So let's start at the beginning. It all started once upon a time. I am the legal part, and so legal part sometimes a little bit boring, but I like to not be boring these 10 minutes. So in 1924, well, it's like a lovely tale. Every year I explain the limitation of liability to my students at the university or professionals. I always like to start by the beginning and the origin, because now we have a situation, but it's not something new. It's something that has been as a consequence of other consequences and other times. And so by this time in 1924, it was the first moment in the international community to legalize bill of lading, because it was possible to keep regular lines due to the evolution of maritime transport. At this moment, there was an unbalanced situation between shippers and carriers, so it was not equitable. This is a similar situation as we have now, but a little bit reloaded. And so ships' technological development was not so perfect, and a lot of risks could happen during transport. So risk to the ship, risk to the cargo. So in conclusion, our maritime adventure. It was very important to share this risk between both parts because both parts would have common benefits. And this is the reason why Brussels Convention established this limitation. It was something new, legal innovation, but with the idea to increase commercial trade. The limit was based on the value of gold, Franco Poincaré, due to the French minister. And this convention was updated by protocols. And the Hague-Visby rules and in 1968 and 1979, like half century later. The idea was, especially through these protocols, to update the reference of this limitation liability. And so the Article 5, as we have in the presentation, says, unless the nature and value of such goods have been declared by the shipper before shipment and inserted in the bill of lading, so the special value declared that normally is empty, neither the carrier nor the ship shall in any event be or become liable for any loss or damage to or in connection with the goods in an amount exceeding 666.67 units of account per package or unit, or 2 units of account per kilogram of gross weight of the goods lost or damaged, whichever is the higher. Well, according to the International Monetary Fund, and one special done rights, as you know, is like 1.18 or 20 euros. So this means that, for example, 1 kilo could be, if we talk euros, so around 2.4 euros, and it's not so much. We calculate the limitation liability, especially the date we give to the cargo, its value that it's in the invoice date sales contract in general. And so now we see that this amount is not so much, and normally, of course, shippers get an insurance contract. Now we have seen the roots of present legal situation to understand better what we have now. After that, a few years ago, the Hamburg rules tried to modify this limitation liability and just to pass from the amount from 666.67 units to 835 units per package, or passing from 2 special down rights to 2.5 special down rights. So it's high. But these rules that had this idea to improve the convention and this protocol of Hague-Visby rules, finally it was not successful. And this is the reason why we talk about rules and not an international convention. But the idea of the international community was, of course, to improve and to get a step further. Time passed, and so we arrived to Rotterdam rules in 2008. Personally, I hope that it was going to be an international convention, and not only because that we are talking about the limitation liability, but also because of the electronic bill of lading that is very, very important, and especially now talking about digitalization in all transports. But keeping the idea of the limitation liability, it was also another step further. And in this case, the idea was to increase from the ancient to the ancient. Well, someone is telling that the connection is not so good. I hope it's okay for everybody, more or less. And so these two special down rights to 3 special down rights, and from the 666 special down rights to 875 units per count and package. Well, similar situation to Hamburg rules related to the limitation liability, because it's still to the Haag-Bisbee rules reference, and so a lot of things happen. I said 3 bombs, just in case we can say tsunami or whatever. And well, we have the hunting bankruptcy in 2016, the COVID-19 that is still on with a lot of consequences, as everybody has told till now in these different presentations, and last month, Suez Canal. When a lot of things happen affecting directly and indirectly to maritime transport and to commercial trade that are always together, is a moment in which all community are together, like now here, and are thinking and brainstorming, because if all these changes are here, perhaps we have to do something, or perhaps not. Let's see. Let's think about. And so I have 2 questions that I think that are relevant. Is limitation liability a balanced answer for shippers and carriers? What would happen if limitation liability does not exist anymore? Well, if we look to the different ways of transport, there are different limits of liability, as you can see in the slide. So there are the amounts are different. As you can see, the special down rights are completely different per kilo, at different conventions, but with the original idea of the Brussels Convention, of course, because maritime transport is mama's transport. So, and it doesn't make a lot of sense, because sometimes we have multimodal transport with the same cargo, and sometimes it's not easy to know exactly the moment in which the sinister take place. So all contracts keep balance between parts. Now, well, if we think about energy or internet, I can imagine myself going through conditions and saying accept, accept. Sometimes you don't read them, and we are accepting a lot of things, and we know that our position, it's very far from the company we are hiring some services, for example, in internet or mobile services. So, and that's the end. Finally, our next step is just to accept what we have. It's really equitable. Perhaps we want to react, and in this reaction, we want to just simply modify the situation, the legal situation we have, going to, for example, to the Rotterdam rules, or is perhaps better to change completely because of the present transformation. Regulation is like deserts, in general, come at the end. And now we have a new scenario. So associations will help to the different stakeholders, as usual, to get a position together with governments. And because our international framework, we have to think about that it's up to us. So it depends on what we really think we have to do. And that's all. Thanks a lot for your attention, and see you later.
Thank you, Rosa. Thank you very much for your time and for your explanation. In fact, as I was saying at the beginning, the item on your presentation today is adding another layer of information. As Lars was pointing before, context will change in the times, mainly to become also a relationship framework. If they are longer in time, they will have some conditions, but also the important point is that they become enforceable for both parts. That's also a very important point. So it's complementary to what you're saying here now. So thank you for your presentation. And now we move into the next slide, and the next presentation and the next presenter. Then we'll come back to you later on for the Q&A session. Okay? Thank you, Rosa. So now let me introduce you to Konstantinos Adamantopoulos. I had to train to say this name. Konstantinos, hello, how are you?
Hi, Jordi. You're doing well. You're not the first one, you know. This is a long name, you know. This is a typically Greek name.
I know you from time ago, and I always mention Konstantinos, not your surname, Adamantopoulos again. So, Konstantinos holds a Doctor of Laws degree from the University of Saarland in Germany. Konstantinos is a managing partner of KA Legal Brussels office and advises on a wide range of corporate clients, governments, and NGOs. And he also presents corporate clients before national administrations and courts in matters related. He has prepared several publications on European law and policy, and he's the co-author of the EU Anti-Subsidiary Law and Practice, a major reference book in this area. So your part is the Suez situation and competition issues, how this touches upon competition. Konstantinos, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jordi. Thank you to ECS for this kind invitation. I thought that I should give the title of the presentation, Balancing Stakeholders' Rights in Containerized Shipping. And I'm glad actually this is the title, having listened to all the previous presentations. Lars mentioned about the problems that we are faced at the moment and how they are going to recur, how they are going to happen in the future. And also just a minute ago, we heard about the issues on liability and how parties' rights are structured in such agreements. So if we go to the next slide, please, then yeah, thank you. All right, so this is the background. I think that a lot of people have discussed about the background. No need to spend much time on this. I just had put here a point that the blank sailings, of course, were referred to. Unreliable schedules were referred to by previous speakers. Delays, reduced port connectivity is something that the first speaker has mentioned. As a result, perhaps, of the mega ships and of fewer lines serving fewer ports. That is also something. And this is how the industry was operating for many years. Low freight rates as well, and of course the mushrooming of surcharges. The industry started to see a surcharge for this, a surcharge for that. Stakeholders becoming very imaginative when it comes to developing a new surcharge. We'll go to the next slide, please. And indeed, it is a difficult equation how to balance all the interests of the stakeholders. I think that everybody understands that all stakeholders are in one boat, in one ship, if you want to put it this way, and somehow they need to find a way out of this conundrum that was yes, problems were existing, but they became more accentuated as a result of the pandemic. And as one of the speakers mentioned, as Lars mentioned earlier, some of these problems are likely going to stay with us for the longer term. So, difficult equation. And what are the issues that we are dealing with? Of course, we are having, and a lot of speakers have mentioned this before, disruptive demand volatility that means that programming, long-term programming of, for example, schedules, services becomes very difficult. We had a huge drop at the beginning of the pandemic, and then demand picked up again. But who knows what will happen next? The pandemic is still not over, and governments are still adopting lockdown measures, which in turn have an impact on demand and supply chains. Also, the measures on social distancing. I think that everybody expects them to remain in place for a while. And we heard about the quarantine issues earlier on. What happens to a ship that with COVID, 15 days out of service? So disruptive demand volatility and the pandemic will remain with us, stay with us for a while. Then you had also, of course, the capacity removals, and of course, what you expect shipping lines to do? They will remove capacity if there is no demand. They remove capacity. However, in this case, it seems indeed that carriers have been slow in bringing back capacity. Once the market picked up, particularly in the US, and then perhaps also in Europe, but mainly in the US. So this volatility and disruption has resulted in the lack of availability of mid and long-term agreements. So if shippers want to ship products at the moment, I think that on the spot deals are becoming the norm. Mid and long-term contracts are no more available, or certainly not as they used to be in the past. The rates have skyrocketed, plus above 400% compared to previous years. And I was looking at the shippers' newsletter the other day. It seems that a TEU from Asia to Europe is selling at the moment above $4,000, which is quite a substantial increase over, let's say, what used to be the norm a little bit more than a year ago. And then, of course, we have the port congestion issues that the previous speakers have mentioned. I don't need to rely on this, but these again, this port congestions is bad because it artificially removes capacity from the market, both in terms of terminal capacity as well as in terms of shipping, in terms of vessel capacity, and then, of course, containers. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So against this background, I thought that I should just list here a few antitrust basics. Why is antitrust relevant here? Because, of course, we have the alliances. We have the alliances that all bring together competing containerized liner shipping companies. And, of course, under Article 101, Paragraph 1 of the EU Treaty, such agreements between competitors are prohibited unless, insofar as they restrict competition. Competitors normally should devise their own commercial business strategies independent from each other and should not talk to each other. However, in shipping, and traditionally, there has always been the view that is shared by the majority of stakeholders, if not all of them, that the shipping companies should get together, should be allowed to cooperate, because this brings efficiencies, brings efficiencies onto the market. What are these efficiencies? For example, scheduling coordination is very good. You avoid two competing ships leaving the port at the same time and arriving somewhere at the same time. So shipping lines, competing shipping lines, can coordinate their schedules. Most importantly, they can coordinate their capacity. They can book on each other's capacity, available capacity, and therefore result in improved capacity utilization. And all of that, of course, is very, very good for the market. As long as, and this is an important point, as long as the benefits from these efficiencies are ultimately passed on to the consumers, for example, the shippers in this particular case. So the efficiencies result in reduced costs and improved quality of service. What do we mean by quality of service? Less blank sailings, more reliable schedules, less delays, and of course, reduction of costs that have to be passed on to the consumers. Another key issue of the antitrust basics is that any joint capacity removals, reductions, must be of a temporary nature. They must be regularly reviewed. Typically, I think every 6 months, 8 months, people have to get together and see whether the removal of capacity that was, for example, justified at the beginning of the pandemic, whether it is still justified, and whether additional capacity should be added onto the market. So the key point that I wanted to mention here for the discussion is that cooperation between liners, is it good or bad? I think that a lot of people around the world, and the majority view is that it is good. It serves a good purpose. However, it has to be subject to strict rules, observance of, let's say, EU antitrust law, as they are also set out in the block exemption regulation. This dates back in 2009. It has recently been extended for another 4 years, so it runs, if I'm correct, it runs until 2023. And yes, and the effective element of this is, yes, competitors can cooperate as long as they don't talk about prices, as long as they don't talk about customer allocation. Yes, they can cooperate about capacity coordination and about schedules, but they have to make sure that they bring on, that they pass on the benefits of this, the benefits of the efficiencies of this cooperation onto the consumers. If we can go to the next slide, please. And this is where usually the debate of stakeholders arrives in what I describe the black box syndrome. And the black box syndrome is characterized by a couple of questions that are still open. According to the block exemption regulation I mentioned earlier, it's okay for container liner shipping companies to get together and to form alliances as long as the alliance market share does not exceed 30%. In the relevant market. So the first question that arises is, how do you count this? And this is very difficult to count this because there are no data available, publicly available data on the market share of the companies participating in an alliance, other than capacity data. So people, this is quite well known. What is the capacity offered by liners on a trade line? And usually the market share is established by reference to capacity offered, to vessel capacity offered. How many TEUs are offered? What is the capacity of the TEUs on the given line? This, however, has nothing to do with the actual market shares. In other words, how is this capacity being utilized? And this is the first question, therefore, that people have questions. Stakeholders usually have questions as to whether the market share of certain alliances on certain routes may at times be higher than 30%. And if, of course, this is the case, then the benefit of the block exemption does not apply any longer, and you go back to the more, let's say, straightforward application of Article 101 of the EU Treaty. So this is a big question mark, and it has been with the industry and with this market for a long period of time. The Commission itself has admitted that there is a question mark there. The OECD studies and ITF studies have also confirmed this. Perhaps there is some work to be done on this. Some more legal certainty need to be introduced on this issue. And of course, the second point is market definition. How do you find the routes? Sometimes there are reasonable arguments in terms of defining the routes in a more narrow manner. At the moment, if I remember well, according to the European Commission practice, the routes are, let's say, Asia, Mediterranean, Asia and Northern Europe. You have various criteria there concerning the substitutability of the markets. There is no intention for me to go into this in detail, but just to leave you with one thought. The larger you define the relevant market, the smaller the market shares may become of the players, of the alliances. If, on the other hand, you define the market in a narrower way, in a narrower manner, then perhaps larger market shares of given alliances may emerge, which would then mean in turn that the benefit of the block exemption might not be available anymore to such alliances. So there is quite a lot of debate about how do you define the relevant geographic market. Expect this debate to continue. Self-assessment. As you know, since 2004, the European Commission has moved, the European antitrust law has moved into a system of self-assessment. So liners, shipping carriers that participate in the alliances, they themselves must assess whether they comply with the requirements of the block exemption regulation, and in particular the 30% rule, so the market share rule. So they need to always bear in mind that they need to be, let's say, they need to avoid going above 30% over a longer period of time. This is entirely their own self-assessment. Shippers sometimes wonder whether that assessment is correct, because on the basis of market intelligence, it would appear, for example, that the 30% market share has been exceeded. So that is another black box element here, that there is lack of transparency. There is lack of transparency regarding market shares and effective elements of the market definition. Lack of transparency also with regard to the costs, because if we remember, one of the basic requirements of EU antitrust law is that the benefits from the efficiencies realized from the cooperation of shippers, of shipping companies, are passed down to the shippers, to the consumers. And how is this? How can this reasonably be done, or how can it be reasonably assumed that this is done if there is no idea about costs, if there is no transparency on the market? You go back to self-assessment. If you come to a negotiation and say this price seems to be very high, then the answer might be, well, we did our maths and we are fine. And that is usually when the discussion stops, and therefore there is a lack of transparency, because under EU law, the cost benefits must be passed on to consumers, for example, in the form of reduced prices. So legal certainty, I put it in the end, legal certainty is one of the main justifications of the block exemption regulation. Indeed, instead of going to the court every day, all the stakeholders need to know the rules of the game, what is allowed and what is not allowed. This is very, very important. It has been achieved to an extent, but as I said, the black box issues still remain, and they really undermine the effectiveness of the functioning of the market, and indeed the legal certainty achieved. Next slide, please. If I may. Yeah. So there we are. So we said earlier, difficult equation. The problems were discussed by all the very good speakers in this conference. So these are the issues. There are the antitrust basics. Where do we go from here? And I think that perhaps in the area of the pandemic, perhaps this calls for an ethical cooperation amongst stakeholders, with an increased dose of assertiveness, I would say. So some principles there would be cost-oriented charging. Let all the parties agree that as a quid pro quo for the operation of the alliances, cost-oriented charging must take place. No capacity auctions, particularly in periods where you have port congestions, and as a result you have effectively a lot of vessels and a lot of containers out of the market, parked at the wrong part of the planet, as some of the speakers said earlier. So yeah, let's not take advantage of the shortages, and let's try to continue to apply a reasonable pricing based on cost plus a reasonable profit, and certainly no capacity auctions, because that would defeat the purpose of passing on the benefit to the consumer. Then another point, and my predecessor also mentioned a few things about liabilities and about blank sailings and what to do next. Narrow interpretation of force majeure. Force majeure in shipping is in any event a norm that is interpreted very, very expansively. It doesn't have a narrow meaning. And of course, in situations like this, I think that the proper negotiation and a responsible ethical cooperation amongst parties would seek to have a balanced approach to the notion of force majeure. What does it mean? How long does it take? How long does a force majeure apply? Does force majeure from Suez, for example, can it reasonably be invoked today after several weeks where the problem has been resolved? But we heard at the same time, we heard earlier, one of the speakers said that the knock-on effects of the congestion have been with us until recently. So can one reasonably say that the force majeure can be invoked reasonably, the Suez Canal as a force majeure today, as a reason for, let's say, a liner not to honor its obligations vis-à-vis a shipper? So that is a question that I would raise. But ethical cooperation means a restrictive interpretation of this provision. Strict rules for blank sailings, schedule delays. What happens when we have port delays, cancellations? You know, the more how should I say, the more clear those rules are, and the more they reflect balanced interests, then they will survive more the longer term, and they will avoid litigation. So I think that it is important in an assertive manner to think about this, because you go into a contract and try to see what is your policy on blank sailings, when are you gonna have a blank sailing, on which route, etc. What is the statistics, and maybe try to put this in the contract in an enforceable manner. Efficient and commercial dispute resolutions. What happens if you have a problem? What happens if there is a dispute? Then I think that in a fast-moving environment, all parties involved will be interested in as smooth and as fast as possible resolution of a dispute. We always advise clients to go for mediation, very short period of time, and then failing that, arbitration. But you know, everybody wants to avoid the long march to the courts to resolve, let's say, a contractual arrangement. And then reintroduction, reintroduction of mid and long-term contracts, perhaps incorporating adequately price review clauses in let's say, to the extent that people expect still a volatile environment. But yes, I think that the norm should be, as a part of an ethical and assertive dialogue and negotiation between stakeholders, I think that the market should see again the introduction and operation of mid and long-term contracts. And the next slide, please. And at the end, of course, let's not forget that there are the regulators at an EU level and at a national level that might be available to offer guidance and help in this respect. It has been widely reported that the European Commission and the FMC in the US, the Federal Maritime Commission, as well as, in fact, the Chinese Competition Authority, the SAMR, they have been in contact, at least informally, in order to review this matter. You know, containerized liner shipping is an international business par excellence, and if there is a regulatory intervention, it has to be carried, I suppose, by most, if not all, of the regulators around the globe in order for it to be as efficient as possible. So I think that the regulators are looking at this. This is certainly, market developments are certainly in the radar screen of the regulators, and whether they will support this ethical cooperation going forward, that is something that we can expect to see in the future, for example, in the area of guidelines or a code of conduct or something like that. With this, I would like to finish. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and of course, we're happy to take any questions later on. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Konstantinos. Thank you very much for your participation and for the highlights, especially for the black box comment. I mean, this is coming back to me on the long discussions we've had about these past years for the consortia product exemption regulation. It really goes to me into this type of mindset. So yeah, thank you, especially on what does cooperation mean and where we are now, and if this really reflects on the current situation. So let's jump on to, thank you. Let's jump on to the following on the last speaker. Sorry that we're running a bit late on time, but you know, I mean, the information provided is interesting, so we'll make it a bit longer than what expected. So Till, hello, thank you for joining us today. Till Schreiber is Managing Director of the Cartel Damage Claims, based in Brussels. CDC is active in the analysis, preparation, management, and funding of some of the largest antitrust damage actions in Europe. Over the last months, many clients of CDC from the transport and logistics sector, but also other industries, have voiced concern about the steep price increase for container shipments and have asked if there is a way to recover damages caused by a potential infringement of competition law. So Till, thank you for participating today here. The floor is yours, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm trying to make it short and skip through some of the slides that I prepared. So I'm going to base my speech on one of the pictures that Lars Jensen presented. I'm the one standing on an iceberg looking into the future, assuming that the price effects that we see are not based only on market forces and market developments, but also on anti-competitive practices. And that can be twofold. That can be hardcore restrictions in the sense of price agreements, allocation of capacities, etc. Or it can be a infringement of the block exemption rules, i.e. a conduct outside the block exemption that Konstantinos just presented. So the most important slide that I want to present is this one. I want to highlight that any person harmed by anti-competitive conducts can ask for a full compensation of the damage occurred. And that is infringed in, that is enshrined in EU competition law. And the damage includes not only any price effect, but also loss of profit plus interest as of the time that the damage occurred. It's important to note that this right is a tort law right, so it's not based on contracts, and that there is also no need of sorry, I'm trying to, can you see the slide fully now? No, not yet.
Sometimes this happens still whenever we share our screen in full presentation mode. If you share it maybe not in a full presentation mode, that although we see the rest, then
okay.
I know this is not the ideal solution, but sometimes this happens. So it's maybe better to watch.
All right.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so if you can see the slide again. So it is important to note that this is a tort law claim that is recognized in EU law, and that therefore there is no relationship, contractual relationship required for the damaged company to bring any damage action against an infringer. What are the conditions to have a full right to compensation? The condition is, first of all, as said, an infringement of competition laws. And that is, in this case, a potential infringement of Article 101. And there are typically two types of infringements. Konstantinos already mentioned that so-called hardcore restrictions, i.e. any direct fixing of price rates, any allocation of markets and customers is per se prohibited. But also if the conditions that Konstantinos set out under the block exemption are not fulfilled, i.e. if the market share is 30% or more on the relevant market, then even the currently allowed cooperation could amount to an infringement of Article 101. In that case, companies and shippers that have been affected by the price increases resulting from this cooperation can ask for damages. And as said, this is not only the price overcharge, but also potentially loss of profit and, importantly, interest running as of the day that the damage occurred. Typically, this requires a detailed economic analysis with a lot of data, with a lot of evidence, but that is really the core of any analysis, because you need to identify the so-called but-for price, which is the price that would have been paid in the absence of the infringement. You also have to establish causality and fault. In that respect, a decision by the European Commission, which is binding for national courts, would be extremely helpful, i.e. a decision that finds an infringement either in the form of a hardcore restriction or in the form of an infringement of the block exemption regulation. Over the last 10 years, the European Commission, but also national governments in Europe have strengthened private enforcement. So there is a framework in place that ensures that damaged shippers can bring damage claims to the national courts, because these actions are brought before national courts, so not before EU courts. There is now a framework in place in form of the EU directive on damages, which has been implemented into the legal systems of all member states and which facilitates bringing damage actions on the basis of competition law infringements. Some member states have even gone a step further and have, for example, implemented specific specialized courts that deal with this type of actions. Also, there's increased case law at EU and at national level that ensures legal certainty in relation, for example, to key questions such as the quantification of damages. What are the necessities? What do you have to prove in order to obtain compensation? Also, jurisdictional issues, i.e. which court is competent to hear a case, and questions of standing. And in that respect, it's important that indirect purchasers, which are typically shippers, have a right to claim for compensation as well, because they are on the receiving end, and typically price increases by container shippers are passed on through freight forwarders directly to the shippers. Is it possible to bring collective actions? At EU level, there is no collective action. There is a representative action, which has been introduced by a directive at the end of 2020. However, that is only for consumers, not for companies, and it's also not applicable in the field of competition law. There are collective actions at national level. For example, in the UK, there's a specific opt-out class action. However, that is only available now after Brexit for UK companies. Other member states have opted for different systems. There's no coherent approach across the EU. In Germany, for example, you have a representative action that can be initiated by trade associations representing affected companies. What has emerged in the field of competition law is the aggregation of claims at a material law level. That has been one model, for example, in the cargo cartel case, where many shippers have brought compensation claims before various courts in the across the EU. And that is a system which is based on the idea that multiple affected companies transfer their claims to a specialized entity, which then pursues the claims in court in its own name and on its own costs and risks. That is creating significant synergies and economies of scale because you only have one single action, and it also creates the basis that you need with access to a broad amount of data, which is very advantageous for an damage analysis, because what you have to prove in these cases is the market-wide effects of a given competition infringement. For the companies, it results in an outsourcing of the litigation, and this system has been recognized specifically in continental Europe, in particular, for example, in the Netherlands, in Germany, Austria, but also Finland, for example, and has been enshrined in the EU Damages Directive that I mentioned before. So there is, for the hypothetical case that the Commission or a national competition authority would establish that there is an infringement of EU competition law, there are mechanisms in place where shippers can claim damage in an effective way. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Till, for your presentation, because this issue of collective actions and options and whatever it comes in here, it gets complicated, yeah, because it's important to gather information and to be in a way as to be possible and to be certain on the claim that you are able to place. So that's really an issue, yeah. I mean, I remember I see here Krista says placing some questions, and I remember having a long discussion with her time ago where she was telling shippers, you always complain, but in the end, if you gather information instead of buying it to third parties, you could be very, very powerful. Yeah. So come on, guys, do something with your life in a way. Yeah. So that's also important. Yeah. That we shippers, although we are global stakeholders, we need to be aware of the power we have. That's very, very important. Now she says, stop. I understood her message. Yeah, it kept into my mind very clearly. So to me, the point now is further than the question that Krista mentioned here. I mean, should there be a compensation? I mean, I've received many, many questions on my private chat, and all of them appeal to the same point. I mean, between Till and Konstantinos. So due to capacity shortages, and all the backlog of the Suez crisis, that there will be delays and force majeure. Shipping lines are not going to provide with any compensation. So payment and the penalty clauses provided, although there is no way as to go ahead with the penalty compensations provided in the contract. So how to react against this? I don't know. Till, Rosa, Konstantinos. And the other questions I have, which maybe later Jan can reply, is the contrast between whatever shippings are feeling or shippers are feeling and whatever the institutional message is from ports, like saying that everything is fine, everything is going well. Yeah. So there are these two sides on the item, and then we may finish. So I don't know, Till, if you want to reply, or Konstantinos or Rosa. Till, yourself.
Maybe very briefly, I mean, for me, the key is that there is a finding either of the European Commission or of national competition authorities that there is indeed an infringement, and the EU Commission has the means to do that. They have means to do, for example, dawn raids at the offices of the shipping companies in order to find out whether the price increases are indeed based on anti-competitive conduct or not. They, of course, also have the means to evaluate whether the quite broad exemption of the block exemption regulation are still in place and whether the conditions are fulfilled. And I think it is key to inform and to lobby to the European Commission and to tell them the current situation and the current problems of shippers that are faced with this situation of increasing prices, which of course will be to a certain extent be negative as well for consumers.
Thank you, Till. I don't know if Konstantinos or Rosa want to add anything to this.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jordi. I think that as I mentioned earlier, my preference will be in getting all the stakeholders around the table, because they are all of the stakeholders, the liners, the shippers. They're all in the same vessel. They're all in the same boat. And at the end of the day, this is a very important part of the world economy. The orderly functioning of this market is for everybody's benefit. And I think that there is a lot of scope. Of course, as Tim says, of course you should always consider the possibility of launching a complaint. This sometimes is difficult because of the black box issue that I mentioned earlier. There is a lack of information and there is a lack of transparency. And of course, a complaint to the regulators has to have some prima facie, some must be based on some evidence of collusion, as Tim said, of collusion of agreements, anti-competitive agreements between carriers relating to prices and to market allocation. This is quite a high mountain to climb, if I wanted to say, from an evidentiary point of view. How do you find this? I mean, we all remember the experience from the signaling cartel that the European Commission has investigated actually 10 years ago. It started almost to the date. And there the Commission was faced with the problem of finding, let's say, a smoking gun showing collusion, and it reverted to the concept of signaling, of some kind of voluntary behavior of everybody towards the same direction. So let's not underestimate the problems that are there. So I think that people should concentrate, should realize, I think that it will be responsible for all the players to realize the limitations that arise from the black box syndrome on the one hand, and everything that is in there, lack of transparency, difficulties in calculating market shares of alliances, market definition, then realizing that legal certainty is very, very important indeed for all the stakeholders. And then how do you move from there? Through ethical cooperation. Ethical meaning that, of course, there is no space for, let's say, unreasonably high profit margins here. There is no scope for a kind of, how should I say, too bad kind of approach to this. We are where we are. The demand has risen exponentially over the last 6 months. There is a huge congestions in Los Angeles, and therefore, it's tough. Take it or leave it. The prices have gone up 400%. I think that there is also not a lot of justification from an ethical or a moral point of view for such a behavior. I think that transparency does not harm. Everybody realizes that they play an important role, and in fact even a public service role for the world economy in this area. So what's wrong sitting around the table, having an open discussion about this, and particularly looking into the contractual terms, into the contracts that are available, and the mindset should be how to keep this, how to behave in accordance with the agreed terms, rather than how to look for the first opportunity not to comply with the contractual terms. For example, there is the Suez Canal problem, so therefore we'll have a force majeure now for all delays, for all blank sailings for the next, I don't know, 4 or 6 months. maybe this expansive interpretation of contract law is not appropriate under the circumstances, and I think that everybody would agree that a reasonable approach to contracts, because legal certainty also means mid and long-term contracts. That's what it also means. So I think that instead of let's say unilaterally pushing the button of non-compliance with existing contracts, I think that stakeholders should get around the table and try to sort out this problem to the common benefit.
Okay, so thank you, Konstantinos. I'm sorry we ran out of time, but well, interesting discussion. I think we'll organize another meeting in the coming months for competition and also concerning the BER, because in the end, it's the nutshell of the whole thing. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Rosa. Thank you, Konstantinos. Also, Lars, who's not here. And also, thank you, Till. Thank you, the attendees. We'll share the presentation later on, and we'll also share the recording of this place. Jan, if you just want to say one last word to everyone, 1 minute of glory for you, the last one.
No, thanks. I wasn't planning, but there were a couple of questions about competition, what can be done. Actually, on the one hand, we were all promoting privatization, decentralization, and I think that has had a lot of positive results. At the same time, we still want to keep transparency and public information. The little things we can do from here in Geneva, we do publish different indices on connectivity. We publish number of port calls per country, the time a ship normally spends in ports. You can see trends over time, but most solutions have to be at the port level, at the country level, and the role of you, of the Shippers Council, is very important. Of course, you yourself have also to comply with certain rules, like you cannot collude either. But there are instruments where sharing information, knowing what are the shippers really paying, is something where you can provide important services in terms of transparency. And this type of event also helps in this regard, transparency. Thanks.
Yeah, that's really an item. Yeah, transparency is really the item and what can unveil the black box that Konstantinos was saying. So yeah, that's the point. So we'll make some future webinar about transparency and regulation. I think that would also be of very much interest. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Jan. Thank you everyone. Rosa as well, Till, and the attendees. Thank you. Let's keep in touch. Stay safe. Thank you.